Welcome back, everyone. Time just seems to be flying by. Today, I'm going to join this bumper section back together again. If you remember from the last video, I had done some rework to these fiberglass corners and filled up the exhaust hole, and it's certainly not done yet, but that first layer is done. And then towards the wheel arch back here, I changed the profile a little bit and fiberglassed it back together. So that's now dry, so now I can do the second step, which is to join this back together. I sectioned like 3/4 of an inch out of this so that it didn't overhang as much in the rear. A little bit more closer to the factory look and just basically more pleasing to the eye. So we got to go right into it. Yeah.
Garage time.
Just really waiting for these pieces to dry. Super solid now. Okay, I've prepared this joint by sort of feathering the edges into kind of a valley. So if I put a straight edge across it, I hope you can see there's a pretty big deficit there. That gives some room for the epoxy to bite into. This has all been roughed up. And it also provides some room for the cloth to lay in there because the cloth and the epoxy together gives it some strength. I'm using some smaller mixing things this time because I don't want to make too much filler. This cup's a little too big to try to match up to these lines. Might waste too much product. So I just drew, in these little mouthwash cup things, I just drew a line on the inside. So I'm going to go 5 parts of the epoxy and 1 part of the hardener. Instructions say to mix it for a whole minute. I think that's a good idea. Just gonna brush this on. This surface should be wet before you apply the cloth. I've already pre-cut these strips. Want to work it into that groove I made. The more this gets into that groove, I think the better the strength might be. I'm not going to obsess about the ends with the clamps on it. I'm just going to get those at a later date. Because the minute I pick this up, if it shifts, then I got to start over. I'm just going to cut this one a little bit narrower. You know that it's saturated when that color changes. It's kind of nice how that color really tells you what's going on. Yeah, I'm not getting a whole lot oozing through, partly, I guess because the cloth is there, it's really retaining this stuff from going, through to the backside. I don't want to create a big drippy mess on the backside because I just got to clean it off again. Okay, so I have a little bit of resin left over, and I'm going to add this filler media. This is for kind of filling up larger areas. It kind of doubles the amount if you add it 1-to-1. So I'm just going to guess here. This really changes the consistency. It's almost like pancake mix now. So I didn't see any recoat windows. It's been about 3 days since this was laid. So I don't know if you're allowed to go directly over it without roughing it up, but I just took the gloss off of the surface with a This is kind of a coarse Scotch-Brite wheel. So I just took the gloss off, kind of dug into it a little bit, and I think that's going to improve the adhesion when this goes on top. So I'm just going to try to fill in some of these areas here that are pretty low. I think I can put some cloth in there too for good measure. Especially on vertical surfaces like this, this works out pretty awesome. Doesn't just run away. And it's going to make this area lighter too. Okay, here's this exhaust cutout, and I wasn't planning on putting material here, but because I had some left over, I added that lightweight filler in there and just spread it into mostly these corner areas where the exhaust had like a flange that went inward. So this isn't dried yet, but it's sort of holding its shape. I've had to kind of pull it up against gravity because I can't move it because this section's not dry either. Let me show you over there. Okay, here's the section that was just cut in half, and so it's joined together, you know, pretty well. It's just now starting to dry. It's not really standing too proud. I think I got 4 or 5 layers of cloth, so it's sort of filled up that valley that I created with my sanding tool. And then over here in the corner, I also have some of this lightweight filler into the epoxy, and sort of that's all globbed on there. It's not easy to spread this stuff because it's got some cloth in it, and you basically just want to wait for that to dry, knock it down, and then come back maybe with a squeegee and do a better job. So nothing pretty about this. This is sort of, you know, what you see is what you get, especially with fiberglass. It's not exactly pretty. This side is now one piece again. This joint here has had some time to cure. It's been actually a couple days. And it's holding its shape really well. It's nice and stiff. I can't bend it. I do need to reinforce it on the back side, but for now, I'm going to fit it onto the car and just make sure I'm heading in the right direction. Okay, this looks really good. I do have some Sharpie marks that are referencing the position, and they seem to be lining up just like they used to. This arch here is looking much better. The gap in between there is not that consistent, but I'm hoping the rubber can kind of absorb some of that. From the rear, I think this is going to block sand out okay. It's just a little bit large right here on this corner, but in general, that shape is looking pretty nice. I'm working on the passenger side now, and it has the same problem where this fender arch is not really lining up very well. And it also is a little bit long. So I'm going to take some measurements from left to right and see if I can maybe just cut it right here and not have to section the whole thing. Okay, I've written some numbers here on these bumpers. Now the first number is the driver's side, the second number is the passenger side, so I'm comparing left and right. 1.1, these are in inches, versus 1.2. 1.0 versus 1.1, and then here it sort of flip-flops, 1.5 versus 1.4. This is 1/10 of an inch. I don't think it's a big deal. The biggest discrepancy is right here. This is just a little bit deeper in the rear section, so 1.9 versus 2.1. That's about a 1/4 of an inch. And then right here on the back, I have both here at 2.0. So I've adjusted it kind of for the best average fit and marked it. And the biggest difference on this side is a little longer, but I'm going to be taking a more aggressive cut right here. Here's a view of the passenger side. And then here's a view of the driver's side. So this side already has a big crack. It might have been hit here in the back or something. I just did a real quick comparison with my contour gauge between the driver's side here and the passenger side. Seems to be, you know, really close to the other side. Okay, here's the back side of this passenger side bumper, and you can see this exhaust cutout has been filled before. It's very kind of crude and just thrown together. And then on the back side, it looks like this crack had been repaired before but it wasn't repaired with any cloth because it just cracked right through it. So I got to kind of dig a lot of this back out. Just got to get my fiberglass suit on. I'm sure there's better protection, but I'm just using a sweatshirt and gloves. Okay, all the cutting and grinding is done for the moment. I went pretty aggressive on this crack only because it was repaired before and there was a lot of flaky fiberglass in there and some bad material was put in there. So I just took most of it out and I'm gonna make layers on both sides of this, top and bottom. So that's the crack area. Then there's this section here which needs to be pulled in and glassed together. So I might have to do these separate depending how I clamp this down. And then this is the driver's side and I want to glass the back side of this to give it extra strength. You can see this is the back side of the exhaust cutout. It's quite smooth on the back side. Just roughing up the back side of this with 80 grit so that I have all the glossy surfaces removed. So hopefully the epoxy will adhere better. This is just progressively smaller and smaller layers of cloth, and it's about 5 layers deep. It's just saturated with that epoxy. As far as this big glob right here goes, I'm just going to leave it there. I mean, it may potentially crack in the future because I don't think this is the right material, but I'm not going to worry about it now. If it's not broke, I'm not going to fix it. If it does crack in the future, this is a small piece. It wouldn't be that difficult to fix and repaint. Okay, unfortunately, I picked the slow hardener, which is pretty slow. It takes about 2 to 3 days for this stuff to fully harden up to where you can't poke your fingernail into it. This is the section that was really the focus on this pass, and it's already pretty dry to the touch, which is good. While the corners are drying, they're outside drying in the sun right now, I'm going to focus my attention back on the center panel. So the approach on this rear bumper is to have a hybrid steel and fiberglass. I did that mostly for fit, but also for weight. It turns out the center section of this panel is very, very light. It's actually lighter than the fiberglass center section. Plus it allows me to use the bumperettes. These are going to attach directly to the license plate panel. And I just like the way this looks better. These are a little smaller than the factory ones, and the fit is, I think, a little bit better. Plus they don't extend down all the way to the bottom, so it kind of gives a smooth look along the bottom, especially when the exhaust cutouts are removed. It just gives like a sweeping look around the bottom, which I just like this look better. I think it's higher quality. It looks a little bit more factory than those RSR fiberglass bumpers with the molded in bumperettes. So this window here will get covered up by the bumperettes, and this is how the license plate panel actually attaches to the car right here. There's a couple extra holes in here which probably aren't going to make a big difference once the license plate's installed, but these 2 outer holes are not needed. This is the lower section that was removed from right here, so I am going to be taking this bracket off and reattaching it here, so I have something to attach this lower valance with the fiberglass bumpers. On the back side, this area has been cleaned out pretty well. I'm going to be doing more cleaning on this, but I need to weld up this hole right here. Just haven't gotten around to it. Okay, here's a close-up of that hole. That's my finger underneath there, and it is pitted just adjacent to the hole. So in order to be able to weld this, this stuff is super thin already. To be able to weld this, I need to make this hole just a little bit bigger and then make a patch panel to TIG weld in. I have this sheet metal gauge, and when I put it here on the side, this fits right over it. This is 22 gauge. This is really thin metal. Just marking this edge with my finger here. Yep, here's some more 22 gauge I can steal a piece from. Just transfer it on there and cut it out. This is going to require a super sharp tungsten. So I have this very old disc that's for tungsten only. This is, I think, 180 grit. That's what you don't want to happen. I had some trouble getting that tack started. My helmet, the sensitivity was wrong, and the helmet was not going dark. So I could not really see what I was doing. So now I got a big hole to fill as well. Not making excuses, just kind of showing you guys that's what happens when you burn through. It's possible, especially with this thin sheet metal, even with TIG welding. You definitely got to go slow. That was only 20 amps. Fixed it. So I've gone, you know, from like about 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, and now I need to create this little crease in here and hopefully get this moon on this side to line up. So I'm going to have to, you know, put something hard behind this and start folding it around. Okay, everything's welded here all the way around. I did have a little bit of extra buildup right here in the corner, but I can grind that smooth, no problem. Okay, quick status update. All the you know, holes and welding are done here. I ended up not making a patch for this. I ended up just going real slow with the TIG welder and sort of, you know, going around the edge, just kind of closing in on it. So I was able to fill that up. Those holes are about 3/16, maybe 1/8 inch. And yep, got all the grinding done on these previous welds. This hole here, oh, it's this one right here. This hole's been filled up. That was the thin spot that kind of worn through. So this still is very, very thin, but that's how it was made. So now it's ready to put on that bracket on the backside. This guy was saved. It took a little bit of work to get it off, and it's not in tremendous shape. There's definitely a lot of pitting on the backside. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a big hole here. And because I don't have a spot welder, which is how this was originally attached, I think I'm just going to, you know, edge weld around the big circle. And that sort of cuts all this pitted metal out and gives me a way to attach it without rusting too much, because then I can flood each side with epoxy primer and weld through primer, and that should keep it from rusting again in the future. So I put a couple tiny welds here on the edge, and then inside this big hole here, I put you know, kind of 3 welds along the edges. Okay, and just like that, now there are 2 of these little ears that are going to attach to the bumpers. Now the bumpers also need to have a little flange on there so that these can mate up to it and keep all this stuff lined up when it's driving down the road. But the welding on this is now complete. Yay! So the next step for this guy is to prep it for the epoxy primer. And I don't want to do it too soon because I'm going to be blasting some areas in the back here, and that's going to rust right away. So I want to be able to spray the epoxy at the same time I do the bumper corners. So let me go get those and check on how they're doing. Okay, the inside of this is looking pretty good. It's feeling hard, like it's mostly cured. I mean, it's not fully cured because I can still kind of scratch it with my fingernail, but it's not dragging anymore on my fingers. So the inside of this is nice and smooth. It's looking pretty good. Next step is to put a little bit more here on the outside to try to build up this valley that I created. And then also I'm going to be working on this side. I'm looking for a creative way to hold this flap here closed. So I'm going to try to use some string. That's got it pretty well closed. So this time I put a little tape on the backside so I don't lose as much of the epoxy as it soaks through. This little corner is pretty well set up. I got several layers of cloth in there, and I have this situated so gravity really kind of drives the resin into the fabric, and so this is very well saturated. So I have to wait for that to dry. That's going to be an overnight process, just letting that gravity keep that cloth really wet there in the corner. So I'll come back in the morning and you know, check it out. It'll be dry, and I'll take it outside for some little UV sunshine. So you know, this is kind of par for the course, guys. It's a ton of work, a lot of waiting around. Sure, I could have bought brand new metal bumpers, you know, maybe $1,300 or something like that. And then I still would have had to modify them to fit the RS flares, and I would have had to, you know, modify them and all the bracketry to get those custom rear bumperettes on there. So, you know, this is kind of my method. I just want to remind you guys, you know, what this channel is all about, and it's really about customization, DIY. You can do this yourself. You don't have to spend all the money that you see in the Porsche catalogs. Just don't be afraid to dive in, whether it be fiberglassing or welding or priming or painting. I mean, you just have to get out there and give it a try. Sometimes I make it look easy. It's not easy. I don't want to give the wrong impression, but I do think it's very achievable. Hope that inspires you guys. I know it looks messy and rough, but I think you guys will like the final outcome. Take care.